The first thing I noticed was not the chandelier or the marble floor or the way every conversation in that room seemed to orbit one particular last name. It was how easily I disappeared. I was standing less than 3 feet from my fiancé's mother, close enough to smell her perfume, when she turned to speak to someone else and simply erased me. Her body angled away. Her voice dropped into an intimate register meant only for people who mattered. I became negative space, furniture, air. That was the moment I understood exactly where I stood. My name is Mara Ellison. I was 29 years old, engaged to a man whose family believed power was inherited, not earned. And at that moment, in that carefully curated living room, I was nothing more than a temporary inconvenience. The Ellery home sat on a bluff overlooking the city, all glass walls and curated minimalism pretending to be taste. Everything cost money, but none of it felt personal. The art was expensive but soulless. The furniture pristine but untouched, as if comfort itself was considered gauche. It was the kind of house built to impress people who didn't need impressing. Eleanor Price, my fiancé Daniel's mother, stood at the center of it all. She wore authority like tailored silk, every movement controlled, every smile calculated. When she shook my hand earlier, her grip had been brief and cool, the way one might touch something they plan to discard later. "So," she'd said, eyes already drifting past me, "what is it you do again?" "I work in nonprofit strategy," I replied calmly. She blinked once. "Oh, how meaningful." That single word carried 1,000 others: unprofitable, small, irrelevant. Daniel had squeezed my hand then, a silent apology, or maybe a warning. I wasn't sure anymore. I hadn't always been quiet. But I had learned years ago that silence can be instructive if you let people fill it themselves. The conversation flowed around me as if I weren't there. Eleanor spoke about donors, board seats, upcoming elections. Daniel's father nodded along, contributing occasionally with the weary detachment of a man who had learned that peace came from compliance. Daniel's sister, Camille, scrolled through her phone, occasionally glancing up to smirk at something I hadn't been invited to understand. I watched, listened, filed things away. I noticed how Eleanor spoke about legacy as if it were currency. How she mentioned names instead of ideas. How every sentence contained an unspoken transaction. I noticed how Daniel stayed quiet when his mother subtly questioned my background, my education, my usefulness. He did not defend me. Not once. That mattered. When Eleanor suggested we all move into the dining room, she didn't look at me. She gestured broadly, assuming I would follow. I did. I always had. Dinner was exquisite in presentation and hollow in warmth. Courses arrived in perfect timing. The table was set with surgical precision, and yet I had never felt less nourished. "So Mara," Camille said suddenly, breaking her silence, "do your organizations get government funding?" "Some did, some didn't. That wasn't the point." "Sometimes," I said, "it depends on impact." She smiled thinly. "Must be nice, doing work without pressure." I swallowed my response. Pressure, I thought, looks different when you've slept on floors in refugee camps, when you've negotiated ceasefires over bad coffee, when you've rebuilt systems after they collapsed. But I said none of that. Because this wasn't about proving myself. This was about learning who they were. Halfway through dessert, Eleanor leaned toward Daniel and spoke softly, clearly assuming I couldn't hear. "She's pleasant," she said. "But I worry she's not equipped for where we're headed." Daniel didn't respond. I lifted my glass and took a measured sip of wine, my pulse steady. That was when I made a decision, not to confront, not to explain, not to demand respect from people who confused wealth with worth. I would stay quiet, I would watch, and I would let them show me everything. After that dinner, Daniel drove me home in silence. Not the comfortable kind that settles after a long day. This was the brittle silence of things left unsaid on purpose. The city lights slid across the windshield in streaks of white and gold, and I watched my reflection flicker in the glass. Calm face, neutral mouth, eyes steady. Daniel finally cleared his throat. "I'm sorry about tonight," he said. "My family can be intense." I turned toward him slowly. "Intense isn't the word I'd use." He winced but didn't disagree. "They'll warm up to you, they always do. Always. As if people were appliances that needed time to heat." I nodded and said nothing more. I had already learned that reassurance offered too quickly often came from people who had no intention of changing anything. That night, lying in bed beside him, I replayed the evening in careful detail. Not emotionally, analytically. The way I approached projects at work when something felt misaligned. Identify the variables, observe the patterns. Don't jump to conclusions. Daniel had never asked much about my past. When we met a year earlier at a volunteer fundraiser, he'd been charming in a gentle way, not flashy, curious enough to be polite. We talked about books, travel, ideas. He liked that I listened. He liked that I didn't interrupt. He liked that I didn't challenge him. At the time, I thought it was compatibility. Now I wondered if it was convenience. He knew I worked in nonprofits. He knew I consulted on organizational strategy. He did not know I had been recruited straight out of graduate school to stabilize collapsing international programs. He did not know I'd advised governments quietly, behind closed doors, without press releases or applause. He did not know my name had appeared on documents that never made headlines because discretion was the job. I had let him assume what he wanted, not because I was ashamed, because I wanted to see who stayed when I didn't sparkle. My grandmother used to say, "People show you who they are when they think you don't matter." She raised me after my parents died. Lived simply, spoke plainly, trusted actions over words. I didn't learn ambition from her. I learned discernment. In the weeks after that dinner, Alina's interest in me intensified, but not in the way one might hope. She asked about my wardrobe, suggested stylists, mentioned how appearances mattered when representing the family. She spoke often about optics, a word she used the way some people use morality. Camille sent me links to etiquette classes. Daniel noticed none of it, or pretended not to. Once, when Alina commented that my work sounded sweet but limited, I waited for Daniel to speak. He didn't. Later, I asked him why. He rubbed his temples and said, "You know how she is. It's easier not to challenge her." Easier for whom? That question sat between us like an uninvited guest. Then came the fundraiser announcement. Alina was hosting a charity gala in 3 months. High profile, political donors, business leaders. The kind of event designed to cement alliances and broadcast influence. "She wants you involved," Daniel said. "It's important? Important to whom?" I wondered. I smiled and agreed, because by then I understood something critical. This wasn't about acceptance. This was about positioning, and I was standing exactly where they wanted me for now. The first thing you should know about large houses is that they echo, not in the dramatic way people imagine, but subtly. Sound slips through corridors, slides under doors, lingers in corners long after it should have disappeared. I learned that on a Thursday evening I hadn't planned to remember for the rest of my life. Alina had invited us over again. Midweek, casual, she'd said, just family. The word family had started to feel like a warning label. Daniel was running late, caught in traffic, so I arrived alone. Alina greeted me with a kiss that barely grazed my cheek and directed me toward the sitting room while she finished a call. I set my bag down and wandered unescorted through a house that had never felt welcoming. That's when I heard my name, softly, casually, as if it were a problem to be solved. I stopped without thinking, my hand resting on the banister. The voices came from the study, Alina's and Camille's. The door was ajar just enough for sound to spill out. "I don't like this," Camille was saying. "It's dragging on." Alina sighed. "Neither do I. But we need to be careful." "Careful?" Camille scoffed. "She's temporary." "Temporary." The word landed with unexpected weight. Alina lowered her voice. "Daniel is sentimental. This phase has lasted longer than I expected." Phase. I felt something in me go very still. Camille laughed. "He always gets attached to the wrong things. Remember the photography obsession or that ridiculous startup idea? This is different," Alina said. "There are timelines involved." I leaned closer, heart steady, instincts sharp. "Once the gala is over and the donor situation is secure," Alina continued, "we'll steer him back where he belongs." Camille didn't hesitate. "You mean back to Leela?" Leela, I had heard the name once before, mentioned too quickly, dismissed too easily. "Yes," Alina said, "her father is expecting progress. We can't afford Daniel's distractions." Distraction. Camille's voice sharpened. "So what about Mara?" A pause. Alina spoke carefully. "She serves a purpose for now. She softens him, keeps him occupied, makes him look settled." I closed my eyes briefly. "And afterward?" Camille asked. "We'll manage an exit," Alina replied. "Gracefully if possible, if not, Her voice cooled. "We'll control the narrative." I stepped back, my pulse finally catching up to me. They weren't cruel in the way people expect cruelty to look. There was no shouting, no venom, just efficiency, strategy, the quiet confidence of people who had always believed they were entitled to decide other people's futures. I walked into the bathroom and locked the door, gripping the edge of the sink until my knuckles went white. Daniel wasn't confused. Daniel wasn't torn. Daniel was complicit. The realization didn't break me, it clarified me. When I emerged, Alina smiled as if nothing had happened. Camille glanced at me with mild curiosity, already certain of her superiority. Daniel arrived minutes later, apologetic, distracted. He kissed my forehead and asked if everything was okay. I smiled. "Of course," I said. "I was just thinking." That night in bed, Daniel talked about the gala, about how important it was, about the future. I listened, and I decided. If they thought I was temporary, I would let them believe it. Because underestimation creates opportunity. And opportunity, when used correctly, becomes leverage. The hardest part was not the waiting. It was the pretending. Once you know the truth, every interaction sharpens. Every word becomes a test of endurance. Daniel didn't know that something fundamental had shifted inside me, but I felt it in the way I responded to him, calmer, lighter, as if I'd stepped one pace outside the relationship and could finally see its outline. I didn't confront him, not yet. Instead, I watched how easily he lied when there was no immediate cost, how he reassured me with practiced phrases, how his phone stayed face down on the table during dinner, how he avoided specifics when he talked about the future as if it were something already drafted by someone else. Alina increased her pressure. She sent me seating charts for the gala for my input, then ignored every suggestion. She scheduled fittings I hadn't agreed to. She forwarded donor lists with notes attached, who mattered, who didn't, who required special attention. I recognized the tactic immediately. Inclusion without influence. The illusion of participation. I played along, because behind the scenes I was working. I reached out quietly to colleagues I trusted, people who valued discretion over recognition. I asked questions framed as hypotheticals. I listened more than I spoke. Patterns emerged quickly. The Price family's philanthropic image was immaculate on the surface, but beneath it were rushed filings, mismatched numbers, and partnerships that existed more in press releases than in practice. Nothing illegal yet, just sloppy, overextended, fragile. I documented everything. Then I followed the name, Leela Chen. She appeared exactly where Alina's words had suggested she would, on boards, in donor photos. At private dinners where accidental encounters were anything but, she and Daniel shared a history that had never truly ended, only paused. When I asked Daniel directly if there was anything I should know before the gala, he smiled and said, "You're overthinking." That was answer enough. The final piece came from an unexpected place. Richard, Daniel's father, asked me to walk with him one afternoon after a family brunch. We strolled through the garden, his hands clasped behind his back, his voice low. "You're smarter than they think," he said without looking at me. I waited. "They underestimate people when they're comfortable," he continued. "It's a habit." "Do you?" I asked. He stopped walking and met my eyes for the first time. "No," he said quietly, "but I learned too late that comfort has consequences." It wasn't an apology, it wasn't a warning, it was confirmation. By the time the gala approached, I had everything I needed, not to destroy them. To let them reveal themselves. The night before the event, Daniel asked me if I was nervous. I smiled and said, "Not anymore." He kissed my cheek, relieved, unaware that the version of me he was clinging to no longer existed. Some people think patience is passive. They're wrong. Patience is pressure applied slowly until the structure fails on its own. The gala arrived the way storms do, announced, inevitable, and underestimated. Alina had transformed the city's historical conservatory into a cathedral of influence. Glass ceilings reflected 1,000 points of light. White orchids cascaded from steel frames like disciplined excess. A string quartet played music chosen to sound important without being memorable. Every detail signaled power. Every detail said we belong here. Daniel stood beside me as we entered, his hand warm on my back, his smile polished. To anyone watching, we were seamless, engaged, aligned. I wore a simple black dress, elegant, precise, unremarkable in the way truly confident things often are. Alina noticed immediately and frowned. Camille scanned me disappointed as if I'd failed to meet an expectation she'd never articulated. Good. The room filled quickly. Donors, board members, political aides. People who understood how leverage moved without needing it explained. I recognized faces from reports I'd read, meetings I'd advised, outcomes I'd quietly shaped. None of them recognized me, not yet. Alina took the stage just after dinner, champagne flutes settling into silence like obedient witnesses. She spoke of vision, of legacy, of the family's unwavering commitment to doing good. Applause followed each practiced pause. Then she invited Daniel up. He spoke nervously, gratitude stitched into his voice. Thanked his parents, thanked the donors, thanked me. His eyes flicked toward Alina for approval. She smiled, satisfied. That was my cue. I stepped forward when Alina gestured, microphone already in hand. Her smile faltered for half a beat, just long enough. I'd like to say a few words, I began, my voice steady. The room leaned in. I came into this family believing I was being welcomed, I said. What I learned instead was that welcome here is conditional. A ripple moved through the crowd. I was introduced as temporary, as a distraction, as someone meant to keep Daniel occupied while other arrangements were finalized. Daniel turned toward me sharply, Alina's face drained of color. I was called useful, I continued, only until I wasn't. Murmurs rose. Phones lifted, discreet but hungry. I listened, I documented, and I waited. I turned slightly, meeting the eyes of a few people who now recognized me, people who had seen my work without knowing my name. I'm Maura Ellison, I said. I design nonprofit systems that survive scrutiny. I advise organizations when optics fail and truth becomes expensive. Silence. I've spent the last year watching this family speak about integrity while avoiding it, watching generosity used as leverage, watching relationships treated like transactions. Alina stepped forward, voice tight. This is highly inappropriate. I nodded. So is planning someone's replacement before they've left the room. I gestured subtly. Screens lit up behind me, summaries, timelines, nothing sensational, just clarity, just patterns. The kind that speak for themselves. Daniel reached for my arm. I stepped away. I won't be part of this, I said calmly, and I won't be quiet about it. I placed the microphone down and walked away. The applause didn't come. Neither did boos. What followed was worse, questions. I didn't stay to watch the fallout. That surprised people later when they asked. They assumed I must have lingered somewhere on the edge of the conservatory, listening for raised voices or watching reputations collapse in real time. They wanted spectacle. They wanted a clean arc where justice announces itself loudly. But the truth is quieter than that. I stepped out into the night air and felt something in my chest loosen for the first time in months. Not relief exactly, alignment, the sensation of no longer standing in the wrong place. Outside, the city hummed on, indifferent. Traffic moved. People laughed at nearby restaurants. Somewhere, another gala was probably beginning, another family congratulating itself for virtue. The world didn't pause because I told the truth, and that was the point. Daniel followed me halfway down the stone steps before stopping. He didn't call my name. He didn't apologize. He just stood there, frozen, as if waiting for someone else to tell him what to do. I didn't look back. Over the next few weeks, the consequences unfolded the way they always do, unevenly, quietly, without drama. Donors asked questions, boards postponed decisions, invitations stopped arriving. The gala became something people referenced with careful phrasing, like a structural failure no one wanted to admit they'd walked across. Alina issued a statement, polished, defensive, vague enough to sound dignified. It convinced exactly no one who mattered. Camille disappeared from public view entirely. Daniel sent one message, just one, I never meant to hurt you. I read it once, then deleted it. Intentions are cheap, patterns are expensive. What stayed with me wasn't anger, it was clarity, the kind that doesn't burn but steadies. I went back to my work with a focus I hadn't felt in a long time. Advising organizations, fixing broken systems, building things meant to last without applause. One afternoon, weeks later, I received a handwritten note, no return address. The paper was thick, the ink deliberate. Mara, you saw what others chose not to. That takes courage. I hope you never lose it. I folded it once and placed it in a drawer. I moved apartments shortly after, not out of necessity, out of choice. I wanted a space that reflected who I was now, someone who didn't need to shrink to be accepted or expand to be impressive. On my last night there, I stood by the window and watched the lights blink on across the city. Thousands of lives intersecting without permission. I thought about my grandmother, about what she had taught me without ever calling it a lesson. That worth isn't granted. That silence can be strategic. That walking away isn't weakness if you're walking toward yourself. I didn't lose a fiancé that night. I lost an illusion, and what I gained was something far more durable. I gained my time, my clarity, my name used correctly. Some doors don't slam shut. They close softly behind you when you've finally stepped into the right room.